outside of your mind, so like then you get into these weird paradoxes of like, what is actually happening here, and that can sort of fracture what your mind always does, which is just cycle through like, what am I gonna have for dinner? Oh, I gotta go to the grocery store, I gotta pick up this, and like oh, they don't have that, and we don't run out of gas, and like pretty soon you're off like over here.
Yeah.
And so I think some of those qualities of being in that practice seeps into what happens here, and some of what happens here seeps into what happens in meditation practice.
Nice. So I'd like to let people ask additional questions and keep the conversation going. So feel free to just raise your hand and we'll ask anything you'd like and make it more conversational. So please, anyone? Go ahead.
We came a little late, sorry. Can you speak a little bit more about how you struggled with like letting go of the figure in your work while putting up a show that involved your figure work?
Yeah, that moment I was part of that fellowship through UNT, so I don't know when you came in, but I kind of had treated it like a giant experimental time period for the work because it was going to be shown only really at UNT. So the audience was going to be somewhat limited, I thought, so it gave me a certain freedom just to like do all the crazy things that I wanted to do, but maybe it held off. And so that work had a lot of figurative stuff, but it had a lot of other things too. It had works that were just language-based or were more sculptural, in the round versus on the wall. Like it was just doing lots of different things at once. And I think that probably did open me up in some way to just thinking, not really consciously, but just like now is maybe a good time to like follow some other threads that were, are in the back of my head about what I could do. And I think I was just like slowly getting disenchanted with the figurative work. And I love figurative work. I love the history of figurative work, throughout time. But especially in the contemporary context, although figurative work is very popular right now, so I probably did the stupidest thing you could probably imagine because it's quite, current at the moment. But I always felt slightly embarrassed by being a figurative painter. It felt a little retrograde in some way. And again, that's probably just a story I was telling myself, but it did feel real. And because I had done it for so long and I tried to be a figurative painting, make figurative painting in a way that wouldn't make me cringe. That I felt like, okay, I could live with that. It's okay. Because figurative painting can veer off into academic and kind of formulaic, a little more easily devolve into formulaic approaches. So yeah, at that point, I knew I wanted to do something else. But I kind of still think of these as figurative, even though I said all that. To me, I'm still thinking of the body. I'm still thinking of other concepts like, architecture, which is also another body, industrial objects, which are also kind of like stand-ins for body. So I never get away from it, I guess. But I don't know if that answers totally.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more.
The UNT work, you said there was a smaller, more localized audience. So was part of your concern that the work wouldn't work out, or was it others' expectations of what they would see in your work when you're comforted in there being a small audience? Mm-hmm. So what were some of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly. I think some of it was because it wasn't like my galleries or something where there was a certain this is building upon the previous body of work or whatever. There probably were some expectations from dealers or collectors or whatever. Maybe that did just allow me to kind of treat it like an extension of my studio. Mm-hmm. Like in my studio, I'm free to do whatever I want. I don't have to show it to you. I can do whatever I want, right? That's the beauty of the studio. So maybe I treated that show and that whole process like just an expanded studio space, mm-hmm. Because I knew it would be a little bit limited to who would come in and see it. And I wasn't necessarily worried of failure, but just maybe that it was going to be an all-over experience versus like, I don't know, it's like making a movie that's, going to be a rom-com cowboy movie in space, like, with a touch of horror. Like, I don't know, that's like really hard. Like, what am I getting myself into, The show kind of felt like that. Like, I'm trying a lot of things, and maybe it'll just feel like a mishmash, I don't know. The thread through it for me was political at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was, in the Trump moments. And so there was a kind of like undercurrent of rage, I guess. Obscured because I never am that direct in the work, but like it was all about that, really.
Do those emotions come through in like the titling of the work, or in the particular color patterns that you choose?
It was lots of different ways. Yeah, some of it was language-based, where I'd have phrases. I would basically, it was writing things down, which I always do, but I was doing it as works, more directly, and then manipulating the words or crossing them out or hatching them, so making little drawings. But then I was doing these things where I would create an image next, or something that's painted next to the wrapped fabric.
Mm-hmm.
So I had one piece was a kind of repeating owl, basically, a little owl that I wrapped and hung upside down, and then had a painting next to it, which was a sort of abstract painting that sort of took apart the word liar, basically. and so I kind of abstracted the word liar, essentially, and put it next to this upside down owl.
Yeah.
And that kind of felt, in my own weird mind, like, a very poetic statement, even though it was sort of hidden, maybe, or like coded or something.
Yeah.
I was always very, very skeptical of political work in general, because usually it's just, obvious and overt, and this is what you think, and okay.
Yeah, I mean, that is political
bad
hard.
political art,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard also because you're working at a very fixed moment a lot of times with what's presented as political art.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look historically, you can see the same motif of like people behavior through political, but a lot of times when artists say I'm a political artist, it's very now and might not translate to what's happening 10 years from now,
right,
or even what's happened in our past, unless you're really analyzing that.
And I understand the necessity for it. I understand the desire to make it, but I've just never been one that could feel like it made sense for me to find my way through it. But at that moment, I just felt like I had to do something. So that was all part of the mix in that show, which felt like everywhere, going everywhere.
But was it hung as a complete show, or were you working as it was hung?
It was hung, I was making all those things simultaneously.
Okay.
So it was a very fractured studio process, but, and I wasn't sure how it was all going to come together ultimately, but yeah, then it was hung as a single show.
Got it. And that was that the one that had the platforms and stuff, the plywood?
It had, yes, yeah, it had stacked. I had stacked plywood. I created the most difficult pedestal you could imagine by, like layers of plywood stacking them instead of just building a pedestal. And then I had drawings on that, and there was things on the wall, and yeah, there was lots of different things going on at once.
Presentation modes.
Yeah.
So can we talk about some of the titles in Hive? And what's the title of Hive itself? Where is that coming from in this sort of like...
it's pretty straightforward and obvious, I guess. But initially it started with just that I was going to be in this space.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little bit of a happenstance that this show came up because your predecessor had tapped me because somebody pulled out. And so I was not really expecting the show here necessarily. Okay. And it came up and I said yes. But then I kind of remembered the space as the old museum, as being this little warren of all these little rooms and stuff. So I thought, okay, well, that's kind of like a hive. I didn't know what to title it at that point. But then obviously it made sense to me as well with the sort of mind idea. and just sort of the component nature of things, I guess, in the work, and sort of the idea of the hive mind, what that,
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that relationship to where, and when I approach these titles, just like I was talking about that one, it puts you in that place of like looking into your own head.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can see that relationship of how, and I see it a lot in artwork and making practices when, you and your friends, depart from school, and then like you're talking about your work 5 years later and you're like, shit, man, that's exactly what I'm doing. Like we're doing like the exact same idea at the same time.
Yeah.
So that working through and how we all start interconnecting with ideas.
Yeah. Yep.
Shifting. So, any particular titles other than the one that hit me that are like particular to you?
Well, we touched on some of the things, like Idiot Joy, one over there. That kind of comes out of, it's also a little bit of a Zen thing, but also a long time ago I read Dostoevsky's Idiot.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was remembering that book, although I'm probably misremembering, but I kind of remembered the main character being a social outcast, but the one sort of trying to be a moral entity working through this society that was sort of like corrupt and like, overly extravagant in all these ways. And that really kind of related to some stories in Zen.
Yeah.
There's this guy named Ryokan, who's a kind of famous monk who would wander around the countryside, basically going from place to place. Sort of an outcast of sorts. He's a beautiful poet, actually, and Zen master guy. But at the time, he was sort of thought of as this crazy nut, who would just go and like play with the children for all day and do nothing while everybody else is doing their thing. So it got me thinking about like what sort of how joy can be a kind of ultimate freedom outside of social constraint in a way.
Yeah.
And how we're all sort of bound in certain ways by the roles we play or expectations.
Breaking free from that.
I think painting in particular is a place that's super, has a potential to be a really free space, like truly free space. And so I guess I was thinking some of those thoughts were creeping in my head.
So are you breaking free of that in this current practice, in your meditation practice? Do you feel that happening? Because you are shifting from, and you sort of mentioned, from this, like, what the gallery and the patron expectation of work is, and which can be really risky for somebody as the...
Yeah. Can you make the old stuff? I really like your old work, Like, thank you. I think my path, as I've gotten older, my path has always, looking back, maybe it's always been one of like trying to give myself more freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I was ever thinking of that consciously, but I think there were certain constraints that I always, and I probably have constraints now too, but there was, clearly certain constraints that I put on myself, or just sort of expectations about what painting should do, or like who I'm supposed to be as a painter or whatever, that I'm kind of like trying to just like brush away and, just be whatever I am going to be and try to, be authentically in that. And that could change, of course.
Yeah.
That shifts. It's not a solid target, but trying to recognize whatever that is now.
Yeah, I mean, it can seem imprisoning for artists when they do get stuck in that like mode of, this work's selling, I'm going to keep doing that work.
Yeah.
And it's just like...
Or it just works. Like I tell my students, we all have like a bag of tricks that, at 80% of the painting, if I do X, Y, Z, I'm going to make the painting work. Like it'll come together and I can stop, and you kind of do those things. And if you see yourself doing that over and over, then it can be stifling. And I think that's why I've picked like a stifling format almost. Like, I'm just going to paint an object in space, which is like, doing the same thing over and over. But then how can I keep that alive? So it's that paradox of like trying to have both of those things.
Yeah, the head of the rock.
How are you developing your palette for them? That seems like so complicated but held together. Like, what's your process like choosing and developing that?
Yeah, it's different for each painting a little bit. I mean, I don't have a kind of set process necessarily, but there's things that lead me certain directions. Like, you know, maybe I don't want it to be too appealing, so I want a little dissonance in there. So I'm like trying to think of how I can sort of create some friction in the palette a little bit. Or the painting behind there, the yellowish painting, it's called Treasure Head. You know, in that sense, I had thoughts about what was on my mind about that painting at the time, and I wanted it to be maybe more overtly kind of bright, and I don't know if it's beautiful, but like, you know, towards a kind of keyed up color beauty or something. And that may be different, very different for another painting, you know, where I don't want that. And then just on a kind of dumb formal thing, I just tried not to repeat myself. I want to try, okay, I don't want to do the same painting again. How can I, even though I am doing the same painting again, how can I do it differently and give myself a different experience? But sometimes that's about mood or something that's on my mind, and sometimes it's just a formal choice.
Is it intentional, like with a lot of them, there's a very hard form, and then in particular like the piece here and the piece directly behind us, that sort of boundary that holds the head or the object doesn't seem as much there. It seems a little bit looser and blurred to the background, even though it's specific, but it doesn't have that hard edge sort of holding it, containing it.
Yeah, I think that's me also just trying to hit different targets a little bit in the work. I think of that sort of bounding line, the kind of contour line, as a kind of cartoon thing in a way. So I am bringing a certain, to me it brings a little bit of a lighthearted character quality to some of the work a little bit. And then in other work, I don't really want that to be as present. I don't know. That's still kind of, I'm still shifting between that a little bit. I mean, sometimes the marks are bounded inside, you know, within a puzzle piece, within the main structure, but not as a whole or something. I'm not sure. Maybe that has something to do with the meditation too. I don't know yet.
Any other questions from outside?
Well, again, thanks for coming.
Yeah, I appreciate your time.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for your time. It's been great learning about everything that you're talking about. And I look forward to seeing where it moves from here. Keeping an eye on your drawings. What do you have coming up in the future?
It's pretty quiet right now. I'm in the studio making new work. I'm scheduled for kind of around this time next year for my gallery in Dallas. So some of that work will be going there, but maybe somewhere else too. We'll see.
Nice.
Yeah. All right.
Where is this in Dallas?
Kirk Hoffer Gallery in Dallas.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.